So we are going to, we were looking into the moderates and all. We were looking on to the subject of moderates and their role in modern Indian history. So among these, we have the Indian Council Act of 1892, how it offended the moderate thoughts, how it fastened their proceedings in gaining a Swaraj or complete freedom from the British. Never thought they intended for complete freedom. The looking into the 1892 Indian Council Act. The main provisions of this act was it increased the members in the Legislative Council and also in the Imperial Legislative Council. The non-official members numbers was increased from 10 to 16. In the Indian Council Act of 1861, the number was from 6 to 12. The number of and non-official legislative council imperial legislative council members was 6 to 12, but it was increased in the 1892 act. So provincial legislative councils also, these increase was visualized, or these increase were done. So the executive council, only one additional member was added, only one additional member was given to the executive council. Now, the nomination of non-official members were nominated by the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, provincial legislative councils, and the universities made recommendations. Universities, municipalities, Amindas, and the chambers of commerce, they could recommend the members as non-officials. Now, the Act of 1892, it gave the introduction of representation of people. The budget discussions were allowed and questions were allowed in the legislative councils. Even though it had many merits, or it was a forward step in the constitution of constitutionalizing India's government, it had certain limitations, and the major limitations are noted here. So the minimal non-official representation despite increased members. So even though the number of members increased, the non-official representation was still minimal. Then the officials retained the majority. The British officials retained the majority in the councils. So imperial legislative councils, and the duration of meetings of these council were just for 13 days in a year and some year. So only 5, and out of 24, only 5 of the unofficial members were Indian. And no voting on the budget, even though it was said that there will be a, I mean, you could discuss about the budget, but you could not vote on the budget, whether it is good or bad. You cannot vote on it, but discussions were given, and supplementary questions were allowed, but they were not used properly. Now, the criticism of the moderates was this act is very ineffective, and it fails to empower the Indian representatives. This led to the dissatisfaction among the moderates. It limits the fuel demands for greater representation. Its limitation fuel the demands for greater representation. Hence came the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. In that reform, the number of non-official members was increased to number of non-official members were increased to 145 legislative members, sorry, 60 law members, and a person first Indian was recommended, or first Indian was taken into the executive council, and that Indian was Lord, and that name of the Indian was Lord S.P. Lord S.P. Who was it? Lord S.P. Sinha, and Secretary of the States. Okay. In the Government of India Act 1919, the number of members were increased to 145, and 3 members were added to 3 Indian members were added to the Executive Council. Charter. So we are going to look at the history or formation of these acts that led to the Indian Councils Act and all, how they have played a role in constructing a constitutionalism in India. So this 1833 Act made the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of India and gave him an executive council with three nominated members. The nominations are done by the Governor General of India himself. The government Governor General and the Executive Council had complete control over lawmaking and its execution. So, and it introduced a temporary law member in the next Charter Act. The Charter Act 1853, temporary law member was added. This is wrong. The temporary law member was added, and the six additional law was added in 1850. Sorry. In 1853, the temporary law member was made permanent. Six additional law members were also added. And in the 1861, one more executive council members added. The law members number increased to 62, as we have already seen. And we have already seen the Indian Council Act and how it faced heavy criticism for its ineffectiveness. So when you are going to look on to the moderates, how they criticized and what were their demands, the demand was Indianization of government services, civil services, especially civil services and all, and how they criticized how the present government service exploited Indians economically, politically, and morally. Then economic disparity and exploitation, and they strongly advocated for separation of judiciary from executive, and also they strongly opposed against aggressive foreign policies that was done against the neighboring India's neighboring countries, and also all these annexations were done using the money from India. So increased expenditure on welfare. They wanted the government to increase the expenditure on welfare. No focus until then was given on education, sanitation, agriculture, and health. So and also they demanded in plantations and all, the British was employing Indian workers. So where they faced crucial racism and apartheid. So all those treatments has to be stopped, and better treatment has to be given to the Indian laborers. The Indian Council Act of 1892 laid the groundwork for the future reforms, but it failed to bring the real power to Indian representatives, but it set a stage for greater demands for